I want to go straight to Clavio, potentially a big IPO, a tech company from your neck of the woods this week. How excited does that get people in your community in Boston?
Yeah, well, Ed, thanks for having me. We're very excited for the Clavio IPO, and I think it's in part because it's the type of company that gets built here in Boston. It's a great team. It's a huge market. They've been very capital efficient in how they've built, and I think that's reflected in the ownership of Andrew at moment of IPO will be over a third of the company. And so I think overall it's just the type of business that's built here in Boston. I think to note, there's also not a lot of puffery around it. They've just done a good job building, and I think they've earned the right to have success this week.
And maybe not that much puffery, as you say, because it's B2B ultimately. It's not B2C, so the retail investor isn't that aware of it. But this is your sweet spot. You are a B2B investor largely. And how much is Boston the ecosystem for that, particularly as we start to see the world shift towards AI? And, well, San Francisco seems to be sucking a lot of the oxygen there.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we are B2B and vertical SaaS investors. And I think, Boston's typically known for its biotech and healthcare. But what we see is that there are a variety of sectors that are thriving here in the B2B space, whether it's commerce with companies like Salsify or InsurTech with companies like Hyde, also areas like supply chain logistics. And then, as you mentioned, increasingly in AI and machine learning. And we've had the pleasure to back several great companies in that space, a company like Tetra Science, which is, Snowflake for scientific data. I think in part what makes this ecosystem unique is the universities that we have in our backyard. And a lot of the leading edge technology and also talent coming out of those ecosystems consistently fuels what is now powering the AI and machine learning revolution that we're seeing across the board. So, we continue to expect to see a lot of great both tech and talent coming through this ecosystem here and fueling a lot of what people are excited about.
When you're an LP in the Harvard fund and in the MIT fund, how are you seeing a desire to build in what is a pretty unstable economic environment? There was meant to be the silver lining that as we had job layoffs, they would go out and build things. Is that happening, even coming out of the universities at the moment?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we are investors in some of the on-campus funds. So Harvard's Alston Fund, MIT Sandbox Fund, and the Dorm Room Fund. And what that partnership allows us to see is the most exceptional entrepreneurs coming out of those ecosystems as soon as they graduate. And we're seeing a lot of thriving ideas and opportunities. Over 26% of our portfolio actually comes from that ecosystem. And, I think in part that's because, people continue to see opportunities. Yes, this market is difficult, but one of the things that we're excited about is the caliber of founders. I think you have to be bold and you have to have grit to found companies in this market, and we're continuing to see that. Actually, PitchBook recently did a study that showed the number of founders and the amount of capital that they've raised. And if you look at Harvard and MIT graduate programs compared to that of Stanford and Berkeley's, it's actually higher here in Boston. Another way to think about that is at any given moment, there's between 1 and 4 founders of future unicorn companies walking around campus and walking around the halls here in the Boston ecosystem. So we're certainly seeing that entrepreneurial spirit continue to be thriving, and it's one of the areas we're most excited to invest in.
That is an interesting data point. And, the story that we hear all the time in San Francisco, I'm in New York this week, but in San Francisco, I went to Stanford, I studied computer science, and I dropped out, and I started a company. I did it in San Francisco because despite the problem, San Francisco is a great place to live and work. If you were going to pitch Boston, what is it that's keeping those founders in the city where they either studied or raised their money from?
Yeah, there's a lot to this ecosystem to like. There's access to world-class talent, both coming out of the university systems, but also coming out of some of these homegrown tech giants that I mentioned, like the HubSpots, Toast, Clavio, Salsify's. And some of the big tech giants from the West Coast have big offices here. So there's no shortage of great talent. And then, as I said, it's hard to find anywhere else in the world that has as much R&D coming out of the labs and the ecosystems here. So overall, I think the combination of those things, plus there's a thriving ecosystem of accelerators and incubators and angels, and I think it has all the ingredients you need to be successful. One of the things that was interesting is, Boston was thriving pre-pandemic, but I think post-pandemic, it's accelerated even more. And in part is because we learned, West Coast investors, I think, learned that they could invest outside of their backyard. So we're actually seeing more later stage investment come into Boston. And actually, some of these multi-geography firms are setting people on the ground here to cover this ecosystem as a result.